Hi, Science 10s. This is going to be the lesson for B5 and B6. We're going to just do a little tiny bit of B5, just we're running out of time. That's the nature of this. So in B5, we'll just kind of chat about the first part. It's kind of a little bit of a mathier part of biology. Um, so from the lesson B4, so again, if you haven't gone through B4, make sure you go back. And I, again, would recommend looking at some of those YouTube videos that I mentioned, just for the visuals of what's actually happening at the level of the membrane. So as we learned, it says diffusion occurs across the cell membrane without the input of energy. So that's passive transport. So if it requires no energy, that's passive transport. However, sometimes it takes a while for things to diffuse, for nutrients to diffuse. Nutrients and particles diffuse within the cell as well. So once they get in the cell membrane, they need to move across the cell to get to the organelle or the target that they're looking for. So that also takes quite a bit of time as well as it moves from its area of high concentration. If we're talking about the cell, like at the level of the cell membrane, it's going to be high concentration as it's moving in, and then it needs to diffuse across the cell, which can take quite a bit of time. So in order for the cell to make sure that it gets the nutrients that it needs, but also we've talked a lot about things getting in, the cells also need to excrete things that they're done with or that they've produced. So that's waste or like hormones that the cell is producing or different proteins or something like that. So in order to make sure that it's getting what it needs and getting rid of what it needs to get rid of, it must work to minimize the distances in which these nutrients or wastes have to diffuse through. So there are kind of limits on the size that a cell can actually be. So if a cell was super huge, it would take too long for something to get from the cell membrane to the particular part of the cell, so to the mitochondria. Um, so if it would take too long for that, then the cell would essentially starve or die off. That wouldn't be great. So to examine how size affects a cell function, we must look at a cell's surface area to volume ratio. So this is kind of back to geometry stuff. We've talked about surface area. We've talked about volume, so in 3D. So surface area is kind of the 2D outer portion. The volume is the amount in volume in 3D. And so we would look for, again, the magnitude of the surface area of an object to its volume. So in a cell, volume will increase faster than surface area, so surface area to volume ratio will decrease. So cells need the surface area to volume ratio to be large. So you want, sorry, I'm not going to click on my, you want high surface area. So highest surface area per volume. So just as kind of a little bit of an example, if we had a cell look like that and a cell that looked like that, if they had equal volume, again, I'm drawing these in 2D, so I'm not really talking about volume, but if they had equal volume, this has lots of surface area. This has less surface area. Less surface area, because again, all of these surfaces along all of these little ridges are places where diffusion can occur. And so thinking about this at a bigger scale is something like your intestinal tract. So we know that our bodies want to receive nutrients from the food that we eat. So your intestinal tract is very folded like this, so that there's lots of surfaces where diffusion and transport can be occurring to move nutrients from your digestive tract, so your intestine, into your bloodstream. So your intestines are really folded like this so that there's a high surface area for diffusion to occur. And again, we want surface area to volume to be really like the ratio of surface area to volume to be large, because if we had a cell like this and a cell like this, This has bigger surface area. So the second one I drew has bigger surface area than this little guy. But if we were talking about a nutrient needing to diffuse across, you're in my way, Flo. Um, if we were talking about a nutrient needing to get across the cell, it would take a long time for it to diffuse across the cell, whereas this one, it would just, a shorter distance that it needs to move. So it's really important that you understand that this surface area to volume ratio needs to be large. So it says, example, so in the larger cell, there's not enough membrane for the cell to transport all the nutrients it needs, and the nutrients take a long time to get where they are needed in the cell. This is why cells divide. So our cells are dividing all the time in our bodies and in plants and in anything. Cells are dividing very frequently because cells want to stay small. So if we had these two sets, so one cell, it's large, or we had four cells, each are smaller, but say they had the same volume in total. Again, these four are going to have more surface area in which diffusion or osmosis or any type of transport can be occurring. But this would have a better, I'm saying better, but I mean larger surface area to volume ratio. And that's what we want. So cells want to stay pretty small because as you increase the size, as you increase the size of the cell, the volume increases quite fast. So the large cell and the small cells together have the same total volume, but there's more surface area in the four smaller cells than the larger cell. So it's a higher surface area to volume ratio. And so that means something like diffusion or other types of transport occur more efficiently. So more cells are better than bigger cells. So if you think back to those cubes that you played with when you were in grade 2 or whatever for figuring out place value, sorry, got a frog in my throat. If you had one giant cube and I told you to paint all the faces of it, it would take you, not very long. But if you had the same volume, so here it's showing that this is 5 units tall. It would be 5 units wide and 5 units deep as well. So if I asked you to paint this, you'd be able to do it pretty quick. But if I had the same volume, but in individual cubes, so each of these are 1, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so that's 5 tall, 5 wide, 5 deep. If I asked you to paint all the surfaces of those, it would take you a lot longer, right? Because there's more surface area for that little guy. So that's all we're really going to talk about. I uploaded on D2L the key. Oh, I'm on the wrong page. So you can look through if you just want to peek through the rest of that lesson. It's calculating surface area to volume for a couple different things. And there's a few more details, but we're going to zoom on to the next lesson. So B6. So we're getting into a little bit of a focus on plants now. So we saw with organelles, when we were talking about cell structures, there's different organelles within plants. They divide a little bit differently. So we'll look at a little bit more in depth at plants. So what I might do in this one is actually just use my key because there's a lot of writing and I know how hard it is to read my writing on when I'm using this tablet. So I'm going to just kind of look at my key for this and talk as I go. So B6, so organization in multicellular organisms, so a focus on plants. So multicellular means many cells. We talked about specialization before, but in multicellular organisms, there must be cell specialization. So that's saying that cells are doing different jobs, because if every cell is doing exactly the same thing, it's not as efficient as if you have specialized things that are doing one job and then are supplying other cells with what they need. So a couple of kind of key parts here. So cells must be small in order to maximize the surface area to volume ratio. I don't think it'll let me. No, it won't. I can't really write on it, so I might flip back and forth. Oh, what have I done? So having many cells makes it possible for different groups of cells to become specialized to do different jobs. So if we think about our body, we have lots of different things. So we have nerve cells that are communicating electronic messages from your fingertips to your brain, so sensory information. We have different glands, so in like our thyroid or something like that, your brain is communicating with it and it releases thyroid hormones that are responsible for your metabolism. And you have cells lining your stomach that secrete stomach acid and are responsible for starting to break down um, things that are coming into your body. So specialized cells are important to do specific jobs. And one thing that we see as well is cells can vary greatly in size and shape depending on the function. They also can actually vary on what they have within them. So a muscle cell, so a cell in your quadricep, in your thigh, actually will have a lot of mitochondria because those particular tissues need a lot of energy. So we want to have a lot of cellular respiration going. So those type of cell will have a lot of mitochondria in them. Sorry if that was so loud. I apologize. Um, so compared to unicellular, so uni meaning one, so unicellular organisms, multicellular organisms can have, so compared to a single bacteria, we're bigger, so a larger size. So multicellular organisms are bigger. They can also have a variety of specialized cells. We talked about that above. And multicellular organisms can have an ability to survive in a wider range of environments. So we see, yeah, bacteria can live at kind of specific temperatures. If they're in water or liquid, it has to be a specific pH and different nutrients available. Multicellular organisms have different adaptations that allow them to survive in different environments. So being a multicellular organism created a big demand for organization in order for all the cells to function in a coordinated way. So this is saying that it needs to be organized, right? Everything needs to be communicating from one cell to the next and from one tissue to the next or something like that. So we need to have kind of a concerted effort in order for everything to work well. So the basic organization in a multicellular organism. So again, we said the cell is the smallest unit of life. We know that organelles are housed within that. So that's your nucleus and your Golgi apparatus or Golgi body. That's the parts of the cell. So parts of the cell make up cells. Cells make up tissues. Tissues make up organs. And organs make up systems. So I think it has that defined below here. So organelles within a cell perform the specialized functions. So when we talked about plant cells, chloroplasts are the site of photosynthesis. So that's where glucose is being produced from carbon dioxide and water, requires some oxygen and energy, or produces some oxygen, but requires energy as well. So cells are the basic unit of life. It says basic unit of organization in an organism. Oh, the smallest functional unit of life. So an organelle on its own is not considered to be alive, um, but it works together to make a cell that's alive. So tissues are a cluster of cells similar in structure and function. So in plants, we're going to keep kind of focusing on plants. I know I keep bringing it back to our bodies, but in plants, we'll talk about the dermal tissue or the epidermis. You've heard the word epidermis probably before. It's kind of our skin, so our outermost layer. So the dermal tissue in plants is usually kind of bark. If you think about the stem of a tree or the trunk of a tree, the outermost plant is bark. So it's responsible for protecting the insides of the plants as well as for gas and matter exchange. but we know that the dermal tissue is different on the leaf and is different on the root system. So the ground tissue, we don't have all of these definitions yet. It's kind of weird that it's in this spot. The ground tissue makes up the majority of the plant. It's found just below the epidermis, and it has different functions based on where it is within the plant. So in the stem, the ground tissue provides strength and support. In the roots, the ground tissue is important for food and water storage. And in the leaves, the ground tissue is actually where photosynthesis is occurring. So we'll talk more about these different parts, I think, actually in a little bit. Ooh. And vascular bundles. So let's kind of keep going. So number 4 is organs. So organs are a group of tissues working together to perform a specialized function. So in the plant, a leaf is an organ, and a branch is an organ, and a stem is an organ, and those sorts of things. So a leaf is made up of lots of different tissues. So there is like an epidermal tissue, there is ground tissue, there's vascular tissue. So all of those tissues work together to create an organ. And so organs are a group of tissues working together to perform a specialized function. Oh, I think I've already read that. So the next one is, oh, it says 5.5. A system, or sometimes I call it an organ system, is made up of multiple organs functioning together at a high level of organization. So in our bodies, this would be like our digestive system. So mouth to anus, that's our digestive system. We have lots of organs within that system. So your stomach, your intestines. We have supportive organs as well. So something like your gallbladder is a supportive organ of your digestive tract. So that's an organ system. So multiple organs that function together at a high level of organization. So they need to work together so that they all have their own specific jobs, and what one thing is doing is supporting what another is doing. So plants have 2 main systems. So your shoot system, which is the above ground part, and your root system, which is the below ground part. So you see the shoot system is made up of lots of different things. So it's made up of flowers and leaves and the stem. And the root system is a little bit less complex. So plant structure, before we look at the specialized tissues and organs of a plant, we need to look at the plant as a whole. So it says use the list below to label the diagram. Use your textbook. You don't have a textbook, so you can just label it from here. So plants have the ability to flower. That's important for reproduction, so the production of seeds in order to reproduce. The terminal bud, so the terminal bud is at the top. A node is where a stem and a leaf are coming off of your main stem. An internode is that space in between it. So this is a node. This is the internode. So this would be another node. This would be another internode. This is a node. This is your internode. Sorry. Maybe it's easier if I go to my smart file. If it will let me. What are you doing, computer? Oh my gosh, what's going on here? Maybe if I do that. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna be so sad if it deletes this. It's my smart notebook that's the problem. Well, I fixed it by, sorry. So if I go to that diagram, I can go in here. So a node and a node. This is an internode, a node, and a node, an internode, a node, and the node here, internode. So inter just meaning in between. Okay, hopefully this doesn't mess up anymore. So you have um, leaves, so axillary buds. Axillary, I don't remember what the exact definition is, but it kind of means armpit. So, like I know you have an axillary gland in your armpit, so it's kind of in the armpit of the tree, but the above armpit. So an axillary bud is coming between a node and the stem. I think I've talked about all the other stuff. So your stem is your main part up here. And then our root system, so below ground. So you have roots and you have root hairs. So now onto leaf structure. So this is a diagram that's important. So this is saying if I took this leaf and I cut it, so it's called a cross section. So you cut it down and we looked at what a leaf actually looks like under a microscope. So this is the, let's go back here. It's easier if I have this in front of me. So this is the top. And then down here would actually be the bottom of the leaf. So this is called the cross section, where we actually would have taken a leaf, cut it, and then we're looking at it from the side. So this top part, this layer right here, let me just double check. Did we go through all of the parts? Yeah, we do. Okay. So I'll just label this and then we'll talk about all of it. So this is the cuticle. Let's just go back here. So the cuticle, whoops. We'll talk about, this is called the upper epidermis. So it's the epidermis on the upper side of the leaf. And then these ones that look up and down, so these are called the palisade tissue cells. So they're kind of gunked up next to each other. So this one, it's probably easier to see on my, oh no, it's not in color. So I kind of colored half of this. So the xylem, X-Y-L-E-M, and the phloem is kind of the other portion within this vascular bundle. So it's closer to the bottom of it. So the xylem's the top part, the phloem's the bottom part. The lower epidermis, so these are similar to that upper epidermal cell. It's pointing at that part. The spongy tissue cells, so we had the palisade tissue cells that were right here, and they kind of look like bricks lined up. They're all tight together. And then the spongy tissue cells are a little bit less organized. So there's lots of air spaces in between them, and they're beneath the palisade tissue cells from the top. And then we have these parts. So these parts are the guard cells. And then this part is the stomata. And so the stomata is actually the opening between the guard cells. So the guard cells kind of, oh, can't remember if there's guard cell diagram, not really. The guard cells kind of look like little lips. That's not really a lip, but so these are the, if we're looking at it, yes, I should have drawn that like that. These are the guard cells. And this part is the stoma. And so that's the openings within that. So just when that kind of comes up, these cells have the ability to kind of open and close so they can actually sit a lot more flush where the stoma is closed. Or they can be open, and that's important, actually related to photosynthesis. So that's the diagram there. Now we'll talk about some of those parts. So the epidermal cells. So you kind of need to refer back to that diagram on the last page to see what it's saying. So the upper epidermis and the lower epidermis. So those are a single layer of flat, tightly knit cells that act like skin. So our epidermis is our skin that covers the top and the bottom surfaces of the leaf. The epidermis secretes a waxy substance called the cuticle. So in that diagram, it was kind of showing it as being peeled back. So there's a cuticle on that top there. That's that waxy substance that's being secreted by the epidermal cells, and that prevents the evaporation of water from the leaf. The epidermal cells actually don't have any chloroplasts and are transparent enough to allow solar energy to pass through. So this is going to the bottom part, so the stomata. So again, those are the openings. The singular stomata is plural, singular is stoma. So those are the pores covering the leaf on the bottom that allow the exchange of gases. So allow the exchange of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water vapor into and out of the leaf. They're mostly found on the bottom of the leaf. We'll kind of say it's almost exclusively on the bottom of the leaf. The guard cells. So this is what I was drawing on that other page. So the guard cells are found on either side of the stomata. So again, those stomatas are the openings or the pores. They control gas exchange by changing shape to open or close. The stomata are actually the gaps between the two guard cells. So most of the interior of the leaf is the mesophyll. So meso, or just mes, means middle typically. So the middle part of the cell is made up of palisade tissue cells. And so those were the ones that were the top that I said kind of look like bricks. They're stacked up nicely, stuck together. So they're packed tightly together under the surface of the leaf's upper layer. So under the surface of the epidermis. They are the main type of photosynthetic cells, and they contain the most chloroplasts. So if we just flip back to that diagram. So solar radiation or sunshine is coming in. It can get through the cuticle and through that epidermal layer, and it's coming to this layer here. So it's coming into the palisade cells. So we want the solar radiation to be able to get to that. And if we know photosynthesis is going to be taking place, it needs a lot of chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are the site of photosynthesis, so those cells have a lot of chloroplasts. Their shape and organization make them very efficient for photosynthesis. So the spongy tissue cells, so that's the layer beneath the yellow that I was just drawing. So they also have chloroplasts. There's some photosynthesis here, not quite as much as in the layer above. They're loosely packed and have spaces between them to allow gas exchange in the leaf. So while the palisade tissues were kind of tightly packed and all organized, the spongy tissue cells, if you think of a sponge, right, there's spaces in between it. So veins are the transport system for the leaf and are located in the spongy tissue cells in the mesophyll. They're responsible for fluid transport in some plants and structural support. So the vascular tissues here. So this is a series of tubes transporting fluids throughout the plant. They're arranged in vascular bundles. Sorry, that's really hard to read. Vascular bundles made up of xylem and phloem. So xylem, X-Y-L-E-M, and phloem, P-H-L-O-E-M. So xylem, these are the roles of these two things. This is really important. This is allowing transport of materials throughout the plant. Very important for the plant to survive. So xylem carries minerals and water from the roots to the leaves. So xylem is taking things that is coming out of the soil and it's transporting it from the bottom to the top. So minerals and water. That's the big thing. So phloem carries sugars produced by the leaves to various parts of the plant for storage. So stored in the roots, and growth and reproduction. So moving out to produce flowers, and if that flower is fertilized, producing fruit and seeds. So phloem is taking the products of photosynthesis, being sugar, and transporting it all over the plant. So you should know the roles of those two things, what they're carrying and kind of where they're going. So, oh, that's the end. Woo. So that's B6. There's not a lesson on that. Again, you can look through the rest of B5 on my key on D2L if you want to see it. There is actually a series of worksheets in there, or just like you should have a blank page that says nothing in it. Don't worry about that. You can just leave that. And there's no worksheet for B6. So we'll see you in B7.